Welcome, traveler. You have arrived at the empty boat, a quiet harbor where words become stillness, where stories are not told to entertain, but to awaken. Here, we do not chase after meaning, we sit with it. These are not just tales, they are soft lanterns, drifting on the river of your mind, guiding you home to the place you've never truly left. In the next few hours, you will hear 25 stories woven from Zen wisdom, rooted in ancient teachings of the Buddha. From Zen, Theravada, and Mahayana traditions, but told again in a voice for today's restless hearts. Each story is a breath, each silence is a teaching, each ending a beginning. So let go, put down the day, unclench the questions, and listen, not with your ears, but with the space behind your thoughts. Let's begin. The bamboo sways, the tea steams, the first story waits. Story 1. The bamboo that bends. There was once a young monk named Riku who had only been in the monastery for a single winter when he began to grow impatient. Though the mountain air was crisp and the silence of the temple serene, his thoughts were often stormy. He had left behind a life of deadlines, demands, and expectations. But within the stone walls of the temple, he found himself restless. He wanted progress. He wanted mastery. He wanted peace. And he wanted it quickly. Riku spent long hours in the courtyard, raking gravel until his hands were red, meditating until his knees ached, and chanting sutras in the still dawn until his throat cracked. He believed effort alone could shape enlightenment, just as a sculptor chisels stone. If I push hard enough, he thought, my mind will obey. My peace will come. One morning, as the first cherry blossoms began to bloom across the garden, the abbot of the monastery, Master Senzu, observed Riku pacing along the outer wall, shoulders stiff, brow furrowed. You walk like a storm cloud, Senzu said quietly, his voice like wind through pine. Riku bowed hurriedly, embarrassed. Master, I only wish to improve faster. My mind is unruly, my breath uneven. I try to control it, but it keeps slipping away. What am I doing wrong? Senzu nodded, his face unreadable. Then he turned and walked down the stone path, leading toward the edge of the forest. Come, he said. There is something I wish to show you. Riku followed him without question, down a winding trail until they reached a clearing where tall bamboo swayed gently in the morning breeze. The air was fragrant, and the sound of the stalks rustling together was both soothing and strange. Senzu motioned for Riku to sit. Watch, he said, and listen. For a while, neither of them spoke. The wind picked up slightly, and the bamboo groaned and bowed with it. Some leaned almost to the ground before springing back gracefully. Others curved and remained, dancing softly with the breeze. Tell me, Senzu finally said. What do you see? Riku hesitated, unsure what the lesson was. They're moving with the wind, he said. Yes, Senzu replied. They are flexible. That is why they do not break. They do not resist the wind. They bend. They yield. And because of that, they endure. Riku nodded slowly, unsure how this related to his struggle. You, the master continued, are trying to grow like a pine tree, straight and rigid, unmoving. You believe that by sheer will, you can force your mind into shape. But the mind is not stone. It is not to be tamed with violence or pressure. It is more like the wind. And you, Riku, must become like the bamboo. The words landed like a pebble, dropped into still water. Riku looked again at the bamboo, this time seeing not just plants, but a way of being, a way of living. and something inside him softened. In the weeks that followed, Riku changed his practice. He still meditated, but now he approached each sitting not as a battle to win, but as a place to rest. When his thoughts wandered, he no longer scolded himself. He simply noticed, bowed inwardly, and returned. He let the breath come and go without chasing it. He let the mind rise and fall like the breeze through leaves. And something began to shift. Not dramatically, not instantly, but deeply. He smiled more often. His shoulders dropped. His eyes grew quiet. One morning, Senzu sat beside him after a long sit and said, "You are growing." "I don't feel like I'm doing anything," Riku said. "That," the master smiled, "is the way." In Buddhism, the path of awakening is often misunderstood as a path of effort and conquest. But the teachings remind us that true liberation is found not in control, but in surrender, not in rigidity, but in flow. The Buddha once said, "Just as a snake sheds its skin, we must shed our past over and over again. To shed is not to force." The snake does not rip its skin off. It waits for the right moment. It allows. It yields. This story of Riku and the bamboo speaks to a deep psychological pattern in us all. The need to control what we do not understand. In modern life especially, we are conditioned to believe that success, peace, and healing are things we must earn through struggle. We grip harder when things slip away. We tighten when we should soften. We chase clarity when the mind asks for stillness. Anxiety, in its essence, is the mind's rebellion against uncertainty. It arises from the illusion that if we think enough, plan enough, push enough, we can predict, control, and prevent all outcomes. But life does not obey our grip. Like wind, it moves on its own terms. And so we suffer. But what if we bent instead of broke? What if we allowed the difficult emotions, the doubt, the sadness, the confusion, to move through us without trying to crush them or hold them back? What if we sat like bamboo, rooted, yes, but not rigid? Try, in your own quiet moments, to notice how often your first instinct is to control. Then ask gently, what if I softened instead? Sit with that question. Breathe with it. Let your breath sway like a reed. Let your shoulders fall like petals. Let your expectations drift away like mist on the mountain. Tonight, before sleep, you may reflect with this. Where in my life am I trying too hard to control what is meant to move on its own? Can I yield, just a little, like the bamboo? And as you rest, remember this simple teaching from Zen. The tree that does not bend, with the wind will be broken by it. Let the wind pass through. You are not here to fight the breeze. You are here to listen, to sway, to heal. Story 2. The Monk and the Storm. The sky had been calm all morning, a gentle hush resting over the monastery like a woven blanket of stillness. The cicadas hummed in the distance, and even the birds sang in low tones, as if respecting the silence of the meditation hall. But by early afternoon, the air had changed. A thick, heavy heat settled over the temple grounds, and the wind, once mild, grew erratic. Trees bowed and trembled. Then came the clouds, dark and swollen, rolling over the mountaintop like an invading army. Inside his modest room, the monk Rio lay restless, sweat gathering on his brow, breath short and shallow. It wasn't the weather that stirred his agitation, but something deeper, an old fire that had returned, a feeling he had spent years trying to extinguish. Anger. Not the loud kind, not the kind that explodes, but the slow kind. the coiling one, the kind that hides behind the folds of memory, the kind that whispers, "You were wronged." It had taken root earlier that morning when a visiting monk criticized his chanting in front of the assembly. "You're too slow," the visitor said. "It drags down the others." The words were casual, but they pierced Rio's composure like a splinter under the nail. He had nodded then, bowed, offered no reply, but his chest had burned ever since. Now, with the wind howling and trees lashing the roof, his anger rumbled, like the coming storm. "Why do I care?" he muttered aloud, pacing the narrow room. "Why do I feel this heat, this tightness, after so many years of practice?" Then the rain came. It hit hard. Fat droplets slammed against the old wood, the roof tiles, the stone path. A branch cracked somewhere nearby. Candles flickered. The air seemed to grow darker, charged. Rio opened the paper door to look out, saw the garden in chaos. Blossoms, torn from branches. A young cedar snapped in half. The gravel paths, so carefully maintained, now ran with muddy streams. Something in him snapped too. He stepped out into the storm barefoot, robes flapping wildly, and stood in the middle of the courtyard, drenched within seconds. He raised his face to the sky and shouted, not words, but a primal sound pulled from the throat of a man who had tried to stay calm for too long. The rain didn't stop. His scream didn't change the sky. The trees still swayed, uncaring. And yet, in that moment of surrender, something inside Rio cracked open, not in rage but in release. He fell to his knees, soaked to the bone, hands resting on the softening ground. His breath slowed. His shoulders dropped. He began to weep, not from weakness, but from the weight of years spent pretending he was above feeling. Later, Master, Sensu found him sitting silently under the eaves, watching the storm begin to pass. "Did the sky listen to your anger?" the master asked gently. "No," Rio replied, "but it heard me anyway." Sensu sat beside him. "And what did it say?" Rio looked at the scattered petals, the snapped branch, the flooded path. Then he whispered, "It said I didn't need to hide." The storm passed, the sun returned, but Rio was never quite the same. Not because he was rid of his anger, but because he had stopped resisting it. The Zen teachings are often mistaken as prescriptions for detachment, as if enlightenment means being above human emotions. But this is a misunderstanding. The Buddha did not tell us to erase our feelings. He invited us to see them clearly, without being consumed by them, to feel anger without becoming it, to let it rise like a wave and let it fall. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha said, "I do not say that anger should not arise, but I say that when it arises, it should be known. To know anger is not to judge it. It is to meet it with awareness, with breath, with space." Modern psychology echoes this. Suppressed emotion becomes illness. Tight muscles, migraines, insomnia, chronic stress. But when we acknowledge what is real within us, even when it is raw or unflattering, we open a path toward transformation. Healing begins not when we become better people, but when we become honest ones. Rio had spent years trying to meditate his anger away, hoping stillness would erase the scar. But storms do not disappear because we close the window. Sooner or later, the wind finds a crack. And when it does, it doesn't ask for permission. What changed Rio was not the rage, but the courage to stand in it without collapsing. To say, "I feel this. I am not less sacred because of it." Ask yourself, when anger visits your house, what do you do? Slam the door? Pretend you're not home? Or do you open it, offer it tea and say, I see you. Sit with me until you are ready to leave. Tonight, before sleep, reflect. What is the storm I keep holding in? What might happen if, instead of resisting, I listened? And as your breath slows, remember this. The rain falls on all things. The temple roof, the rotten stump, the polished stone. It does not choose. It simply falls. Let your feelings come like rain. Let them fall. They will not ruin you. They will pass. And when they do, something still and honest will remain. Story 3. The Bowl of Impermanence. There was a bowl in the monastery unlike any other. It sat alone in a quiet alcove of the meditation hall, carved from obsidian black stone, with tiny golden veins running through it like lightning frozen in silence. No one remembered exactly who had brought it to the temple. Some said it had belonged to a great teacher. Others believed it was found in a stream long ago. But everyone knew the rule. No one touched the bowl. It was not forbidden exactly, just respected, watched from a distance. Every morning the monks bowed to it briefly as they passed, and every evening the candlelight would reflect from its dark surface, casting faint golden ripples on the wall behind it. Young Akira had only been at the monastery for a few months when he first noticed the bowl. He became quietly obsessed with it, not in a possessive way, but with a kind of reverent curiosity. What was it for? Why was it never used? And why did it make his chest feel strange, like something ancient was waking up in his ribs? One winter morning, while sweeping the meditation hall alone, Akira felt drawn to the alcove. The sky outside was white with snow, the air silent and reverent. He stepped closer. The bowl looked heavier than it appeared, as though it held something more than space. Without fully understanding why, he reached out, lifted it gently, and turned it in his hands. It was colder than he expected, solid, flawless. The golden veins shimmered faintly as if alive. He felt the desire to sit and simply hold it. So he did. But the floor was cold, and he shifted slightly. In that small movement, just a tremble of inattention, the bowl slipped from his lap, hit the stone floor, and cracked with a sharp, final sound. The sound echoed. Akira froze. A line split through the center of the bowl like a wound, running through its core. The golden veins had not saved it. The bowl was broken. For a long time, he sat there, the two halves resting in his lap, his hands shaking. Fear rose, and then shame. Then something else. Grief. Not over the bowl alone, but over something unnamed, as if he had broken something inside himself. When he heard footsteps, he did not hide. He simply bowed his head and waited. Master Senzu entered, looked at the broken bowl, then at Akira, and said nothing. After a while, he sat beside the boy. "Do you know the story of this bowl?" the master asked. Akira shook his head. Senzu placed his hand on the stone floor. It belonged to a monk who came here 100 winters ago. He was known for his brilliance, but also for his pride. One day, after a deep realization, he came to me and said, "Master, I have finally let go of my attachment to things." Then he smiled, placed this bowl in the alcove and said, "Let it sit here as a reminder of what I once clung to." Akira stared at the broken halves. "I didn't mean to." "I know," said the master. And so did the bowl. For a moment, Akira didn't understand. Then Senzu added, "Everything in this world was born to break, not as failure, but as form. The bowl was not sacred because it lasted. It was sacred because it reminded us how nothing does. The next day, Akira gathered the pieces and under Senzu's guidance began to repair them, not to restore the bowl to its old state, but to honor its brokenness. They melted gold and poured it gently into the crack, following an ancient practice called kintsugi, the art of embracing imperfection. When it was done, the bowl no longer looked flawless. The break was visible, gleaming gold against the black. It did not hide what had happened, it illuminated it. The bowl was returned to the alcove, but now each monk who passed bowed longer. Some paused in stillness, others wept. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha teaches, all compounded things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence. This does not mean we must fear loss. It means we must love things and people, knowing they will pass, knowing they are passing even now. Impermanence is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. The broken bowl teaches us this. So do the lines in our faces, the wrinkles in our hands, the people we miss, the moments we wish had lasted just a little longer. Every crack is a doorway to presence. In psychology, grief and anxiety often stem from resistance to impermanence. We want the job to last, the body to stay strong, the loved one not to die, the perfect moment not to end. But all things rise and fall. Nothing holds its shape forever. To suffer is to demand permanence in a world of wind. To awaken is to see the beauty in the crack, the story in the scar, the wholeness in what once was broken. Let yourself feel the ache of loss, not to fix it, but to know you have loved. Let your heart break, not as failure, but as opening. A broken heart lets more light in than a closed one ever could. Tonight, before you sleep, reflect. What have I lost that I still grieve? And can I let that grief become gold? Not to erase the crack, but to honor it. And as your eyes grow heavy, remember this. Even the moon will one day shatter. But while it shines, we bow. Let your brokenness shine. It is not the end of your story. It is the most beautiful line. Story 4. The lotus in the mudit was early spring when Aiko arrived at the temple, barefoot and shivering, her robes stained from days on the road. Her eyes were not the eyes of a seeker. They were the eyes of someone running from a storm. She spoke little, bowed often, and avoided mirrors. The other novices noticed, but no one asked. In the monastery, silence was not suspicion. It was sanctuary. Master Senzu watched her from afar. He had seen this kind of pain before, not sharp like a wound, but dull like old bruises that refused to fade. Aiko moved like someone carrying a weight no one else could see. She never complained. She rose before dawn, scrubbed the meditation hall until her fingers chafed, and memorized every sutra placed before her. But her eyes remained distant, as though her body had arrived. But her spirit lagged behind. One morning, during garden meditation, Senzu approached her as she sat motionless by the pond. He said nothing at first, just sat beside her, the way the mountain sits beside the wind, offering company without question. Finally, he broke the silence. Do you know why the lotus is so revered in our tradition? Aiko didn't answer right away. Because it's beautiful, she said flatly. Senzu smiled. Yes, but also because of where it grows. He pointed toward the edge of the pond, where the water darkened and thickened into sludge. From the murky depths, a slender green stalk pushed through, crowned by a single white bloom, untouched by the filth from which it rose. The lotus is not born in purity, he said. It is born in mud, yet it opens all the same. Aiko looked at the flower, her expression unreadable. There is no shame in the mud, he added, only in believing it defines you. That evening, alone in her room, Aiko unfolded the letter she kept hidden in her sleeve, creased and worn from too many readings. It was from her mother, written months ago. A letter of forgiveness, of love, of a door left open. A letter Aiko had not yet answered. She had come to the temple to escape what she had done, the bitter arguments, the theft, the shame she had thrown at those who tried to love her. She had come seeking purification, but had only found silence, until the lotus. The next morning, she returned to the pond and knelt in the mud. Not by accident, not as punishment, but as a prayer. She dug gently around the roots of a nearby flower, hands thick with muck, heart trembling. She stayed there for hours, hands deep in the filth, whispering apologies to no one in particular. When Senzu found her, she looked up and said only, "I'm tired of pretending I wasn't part of the mud." He said nothing. He only placed a small seed in her palm. "Plant this one," he said. "Let it be yours." And so she did. Each morning, Aiko rose early, not to escape, but to care. She tended the pond not to fix what was wrong with her, but to understand what was right about the brokenness. As the seasons shifted, so did she. One summer evening, a single lotus bloomed at the edge of the water. Not the purest, not the tallest, but hers. She didn't need to tell anyone. It wasn't a declaration. It was a quiet becoming. The Buddha once said, "As the lotus rises from muddy water, yet remains unstained, so too the wise rise above the world. But this rising is not avoidance. It is not denial of pain or a bypass of the shadow. The lotus does not reject the mud. It requires it. Without darkness, there is no upward path. Without sorrow, no yearning for light." In modern healing, we are often taught to move on quickly, to clean up the mess, to bury the shame. But healing does not come from erasure. It comes from acknowledgement, from sitting in the mud, hands trembling, heart open, from seeing that our pain is not proof we are broken, but proof we have lived. Many who suffer carry a silent belief. Because I hurt, I must be unworthy. Because I fell, I must be less. But the lotus says otherwise. It says, "I am beautiful, not despite my roots in darkness, but because of them." Trauma, grief, addiction, regret. These are the swamps of the spirit. We cannot skip over them, but we can walk through them, gently, with care, with breath, with patience, until, one day, we realize we have bloomed. What does this mean for you, dear listener? Perhaps you are in your mud season. Perhaps the world feels thick and slow and too heavy. Perhaps you wonder if anything beautiful could grow from what you've done, or what's been done to you. It can. It does. But not by force. By presence. By planting seeds even when you can't see the sun. By believing that even now, below the surface, something is quietly reaching upward. Tonight, before you rest, reflect. What is the mud I carry that I have not yet honored? Can I hold it, not with shame, but with softness? Can I see it not as my flaw, but as my soil? And as sleep gently takes you, remember this. The lotus never rushes. It opens when it is ready, and so will you. Rest in the mud. Let it soften. You, let it become the place where something sacred begins to rise. Story 5. The Pause. Before the arrow, long ago, in the highlands where pines curled like incense smoke and rivers carved songs into the cliffs, there lived a renowned archer named Daisetsu. His skill was unmatched. They said he could split a falling leaf in mid-air, strike a deer from the far end of a valley, and hit a target in complete darkness, guided only by breath. Kings and monks alike came to watch him shoot, and even the wind seemed to hush when he raised his bow. But despite his fame, Daisetsu was restless. He felt a growing hollow inside him, an agitation that even perfect aim could not quiet. He had mastered every technique, but with each arrow loosed, something tightened in his chest. It was subtle, but constant. A pressure, like a question he didn't yet know how to ask. One day, after a long and flawless demonstration before a local lord, he wandered deep into the forest. There, in a small glade beside a stream, he came upon an old monk seated on a flat rock, eyes closed, unmoving. Daisetsu watched the monk for some time, puzzled by the stillness. At last he said, "You sit so quietly, yet you seem full of purpose. May I ask what it is you seek?" The monk opened his eyes and smiled gently. "I seek nothing," he said. "I only sit. The seeking passes on its own." Daisetsu furrowed his brow. "Then you have no goal?" The monk nodded. "Not one I can aim at." Daisetsu sat beside him. "I'm an archer," he said. "I always aim." "Then let me ask you," the monk replied. "When you draw your bow, where is your mind?" Daisetsu answered immediately. "On the target." "And when you release the arrow, where is your mind?" "Still on the target." "And when you miss?" Daisetsu hesitated. "On the failure." The monk smiled again. "And when you hit it?" A longer pause. "Still not at peace." The monk picked up a twig and traced a circle in the dirt. "Most live like this," he said, pointing to the outer ring. "Always at the edge, chasing the mark. But peace," he said, touching the center, "lives in the pause before the arrow flies. The moment you draw, breathe, and become so still, the wind forgets to move." Daisetsu didn't understand right away, but something about the monk's words lodged in his ribs. He returned to the temple with a quiet ache and began to change his practice. He no longer aimed simply to strike. Instead, he watched how his breath moved when he raised the bow. He listened to the sound between his heartbeats. He paid attention not to the arrow, but to the pause, the breathless moment just before release, and, in that pause, something began to shift. His grip softened, his shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in his life, he noticed the tremble in his own fingers, not as weakness, but as life. In the seasons that followed, Daisetsu became known not only as a great archer, but as one who taught through silence. He would raise his bow, draw it back slowly, hold, and then lower it without firing. People murmured. Some laughed, but others watched with tears in their eyes, touched by a lesson they couldn't quite name. Eventually, he left competition entirely. He kept his bow, but no longer sought targets. Instead, he sat each morning in his garden, bow resting across his knees, breathing with the trees. It was said he died in meditation, an arrow across his lap, a faint smile on his lips. The Zen path reminds us mastery is not found in perfect execution, but in full presence. The pause before the arrow flies is life itself, pure, still, unconditioned. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." Likewise, Better than 1,000 arrows is one breath held in awareness. In our modern lives, we are trained to fire without pause, to respond instantly, react immediately, to answer before the question lands. But the deepest truths are found in the spaces we skip, between words, between thoughts, between impulse and action. Psychology calls it response inhibition, or mindful pause, the ability to resist reactive behavior. It is the gateway to emotional intelligence, to healing, to empathy. A pause can prevent regret. A pause can save a relationship. A pause can change your life. But pausing is hard. When we feel anger rise or shame flare, or the urge to prove ourselves raw, we want to release the arrow right away. We want to let it fly. Say the thing, do the thing, make the impact. But Zen whispers, wait, sit with the arrow, feel the breath, become the space. For in that space, we find not just control, but clarity, compassion, liberation. Tonight before sleep, reflect. What arrow am I too quick to release? What truth might I find in the moment before reaction? Can I let my next breath be my teacher? And as your mind softens, as your body folds into the quiet of rest, remember this. The arrow does not fly faster because you rush. It flies true when you let it go from stillness. Let stillness be your bow. Let breath be your aim. Let peace be the target you no longer need to hit. Story 6. The Gate Without Locks. At the far edge of the monastery grounds stood an ancient wooden gate, its frame bowed with age, hinges rusted, and latch long gone. Moss crept up its sides, and ivy hung down like quiet laughter. There was no lock, no guard, no wall, just the gate, standing alone in an open field, dividing nothing from nothing. Newcomers often asked why it was still there, why the monks didn't remove it or replace it with something useful. Master Senzu always smiled and replied, because it reminds us of something important. But he never said what. One autumn morning, a young man named Haru arrived at the monastery, ragged and exhausted. He had travelled from the southern cities, through forests and over mountains, carrying nothing but a satchel and the weight of his own confusion. He had left behind a life of ambition, titles, plans, goals polished like armour. But the further he chased clarity, the more it slipped through his fingers. His mind was a maze of unfinished answers. He came seeking peace. The monks welcomed him kindly as they always did, gave him food, a place to sleep, and left him in silence to settle. But Haru could not settle. Every meditation was interrupted by thoughts, memories, regrets, arguments he'd had with himself 100 times. Every walk around the temple grounds felt like a loop through the same unresolved ache. He began to feel ashamed. Others seemed calm, serene. Yet his own mind roared like a crowded market. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered out beneath the stars and found himself standing before the old gate. The moon was full, casting long shadows, and the wind stirred the grass in waves. Haru stared at the gate for a long time. Then, almost without thinking, he stepped through. Nothing happened. No change, no insight, just open air. He stepped back through again. Still nothing. Frustrated, he kicked the dirt and muttered, "What kind of gate is this?" Behind him, a voice answered, "The kind that shows you what's not there." It was Master Senzu. Haru bowed, hastily, embarrassed. "I don't understand," he admitted. Senzu walked to the gate and placed a hand on the old wood. "Most people," he said, "spend their lives building walls. Walls of belief, identity, opinion, then they build gates to protect them. But here, he knocked lightly. There is no wall, only the idea of one. Haru looked at the gate again, this time with new eyes. We come to Zen, Senzu continued, believing we must get somewhere, unlock something, change entirely. But there is no lock, no key, no secret door. Only this, the realization that what you're fighting against may not be real. Haru blinked. So, what am I supposed to do? Look closely, the master said. What keeps you out? Haru hesitated, then whispered, Nothing. Senzu nodded. And what lets you in? Nothing. The wind passed between them like a breath. The gate, Senzu said, is your mind. You can step through whenever you're ready, but only if you see there's nothing blocking the way. In the weeks that followed, Haru's practice changed. He no longer struggled to force his thoughts away during meditation. Instead, he watched them arrive, like clouds crossing the sky, and watched them drift. He noticed how many of his anxieties were built from beliefs he had never questioned, that he must always improve, always prove, always become. But with each step back, those beliefs began to loosen. One afternoon, during walking meditation, he paused before the gate once more. He bowed, not to the wood, but to the space it framed. And then he smiled. The Buddha once taught, "There is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path." This is the paradox. We spend our lives searching for what was never hidden. In psychology, this is known as cognitive distortion, the mind's tendency to create imagined barriers, false assumptions, fixed identities. We say, I can't be at peace until I fix this. I'm not good enough until I become that. We place conditions around our worth, our healing, our freedom. But Zen points to the absence of those conditions. It says, what if the door is already open? What if there's no door at all? The mind builds gates where there are none. It attaches to roles, fears, future outcomes, and past regrets, then believes it must break through. But often, the greatest freedom is not in fighting the gate, it's in seeing through it. Ask yourself, what are the invisible rules you live by? The conditions you've placed on your own peace? Who told you you needed permission to rest, forgive, to feel whole? Tonight, before sleep, reflect. What gate have I imagined between myself and peace? Can I see that the latch was never there? Can I walk through anyway? And as your breath slows, as silence gathers like mist, remember this. You are not locked out. You were never locked in. Step through, not because the gate opened, but because it was never closed. The space is waiting. You are already home. Story 7. The Tea. That cooled, the afternoon sun leaned softly through the paper windows of the temple's tea room, casting golden slats of light across the tatami mats. A gentle breeze stirred the hanging scrolls, and the scent of roasted barley and bamboo floors filled the air like memory. Jun, a young monk with furrowed brows and a habit of overthinking everything, sat before Master Sensu, watching the steam curl from his teacup. He had come with questions, burning, intricate, unrelenting questions about karma, about enlightenment, about how to stop the constant spinning of his mind. But the master hadn't answered. Not yet. Instead, he poured 2 cups of tea, set one before Jun, and began sipping his own in silence. Jun waited and waited. He eyed the steam, growing thinner by the second. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat. The cup in front of him sat untouched, its surface gleaming like a mirror. He wondered if this was a test. Finally, unable to contain himself, he blurted out, "Master, if I may, shouldn't we drink the tea while it's still hot?" Senzu paused mid-sip, raised an eyebrow, and said gently, "Exactly." Jun blinked. "Exactly," the master nodded, placing his cup down with care. "You ask about truth, about the great teachings, about how to calm the mind, but you miss the one truth already before you." June looked down at the untouched tea, now growing cold. "The moment," said Senzu, "does not wait for us to be ready." Silence settled again, deeper this time. Jun stared at the cup. How often had he waited for conditions to be perfect before acting, before speaking, before feeling peace? How often had he missed the warmth of life by holding back, hesitating, getting lost in thought? He picked up the cup and took a sip. It was lukewarm but soothing. Senzu smiled. "The tea is still good, but its warmth belonged to another moment, one you passed waiting for something else." That night, Jun could not sleep. Not from anxiety, but from a stirring he couldn't quite name. He walked the temple corridors, now bathed in moonlight, and passed by scenes he usually overlooked. A flickering lantern, the creak of old wood, the soft snores of monks at rest. He began to see that every moment was offering him tea, simple, fleeting gifts of now. But how often had he declined them, hoping instead for grander answers, for clarity with a capital C? Over the next weeks, Jun stopped trying to solve Zen. He stopped treating it like a riddle. Instead, he swept leaves with full attention. He ate with quiet joy. He bowed not to tradition, but to presence. And slowly, the ache of seeking began to soften. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." But this is not always easy. In modern life, the mind is pulled constantly by news, deadlines, endless decisions. We become caught in what psychologists call anticipatory anxiety, the habit of mentally preparing for problems that haven't happened yet, rehearsing life instead of living it. Like Jun, we often wait for the right mood, the right moment, the perfect clarity before we allow ourselves to enjoy what's already in our hands. We scroll past the warmth, postpone joy, and sip the tea only after it's gone cold. Yet mindfulness, at its essence, is not about constant concentration. It's about quiet recognition. This is the moment. This is the tea. And then being with it, even for one breath, even for one sip. There is a simplicity in presence that many overlook because it feels too small, too quiet. But if you've ever listened to rain without needing it to stop, or watched a candle flame flicker without rushing it, you've tasted this truth already. Zen doesn't promise answers. It offers tea, steam rising, warmth fading, a chance to say yes before it passes. Tonight, before sleep, ask yourself, what moments have I let go cold today? Can I forgive myself? And tomorrow, can I drink the tea while it's hot? And as you close your eyes, drifting into the gentle dark, remember this: the cup is never empty, but the warmth belongs to those who notice. May you notice, may you sip slowly, may the next cup find you ready. Story 8. The dog that chased its tail in a dusty town by the edge of a river, where the sun fell hot on clay rooftops and the bells of bicycles echoed through narrow streets. There lived a man named Kaito, who had everything and nothing at once. From The outside, he was successful. He owned 3 shops, wore silk robes, ate from polished bowls, and kept a house full of carved wood and fine ink paintings. People bowed to him when he passed. Children watched him with curiosity. But Kaito's mind was not at peace. Every night he sat awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why a life so full felt so hollow. He had achieved what he once dreamed of, yet the hunger remained. One morning, after another night of restless sleep, Kaito watched through his window as a stray dog ran in circles in the courtyard. It chased its tail with wild determination, snarling, growling, spinning until it collapsed, dizzy and panting, only to get up and chase again. Kaito watched for several minutes, puzzled. Then, without thinking, he stepped outside, knelt down, and whispered to the dog, "Why do you chase something that's already yours?" The dog, of course, gave no answer. But the question lingered. That afternoon, Kaito left his shops in the care of others and walked up the hill outside town where a small Zen hermitage sat quiet among pines. He had passed it many times, never thinking to enter. This time, he bowed at the gate and asked to see the teacher. The teacher, an old woman with silver hair tied in a loose knot, welcomed him without question. They sat on the wooden deck overlooking the trees. Kaito did not know how to begin. Finally, he said, "I feel like a dog chasing its tail. No matter how much I gain, I feel no closer to peace." The teacher poured him tea. He continued, "I thought success would quiet the restlessness inside me, but the more I acquire, the more distant peace becomes." The teacher handed him the cup. "When did the dog begin chasing?" she asked. He blinked. "I'm not sure. Maybe always." "And if the tail were cut off?" she asked. "Would the dog rest?" Kaito frowned. "No, it would chase something else." She smiled gently. "Then perhaps the tail is not the problem." He sat quietly, feeling something loosen in his chest. "The mind," she continued, "believes happiness is just around the corner, one goal away, one possession away, one change away. But that corner always moves. The chase is endless, not because the object is far, but because the seeking never ends." They sipped tea in silence. That evening, Kaito returned home. He did not make any grand decisions. He did not give away his wealth, sell his shops, or run to the mountains. Instead, he began to walk more slowly. He began to eat without distractions. He began to notice the steam from his tea before he drank it. He no longer counted how many things he had, but how often he was truly present for any of them. He still had success. But now it didn't define him. The hunger didn't vanish overnight, but he no longer fed it with more. He watched it, sat with it, breathed into it. And sometimes when the nights were clear and the moon hung low over the river, he would sit on his porch and watch the same dog, now older, lying still in the courtyard, tail gently curled, at peace. The Buddha taught, "There is no satisfying the craving that leads to craving more. Like a man drinking salt water, he only becomes thirstier." Modern life thrives on the promise of fulfillment through more productivity, more praise, more progress. We are taught to chase goals as though peace lies at the finish line. But the finish line keeps moving. It must, or the system collapses. This is not to say ambition is wrong, only that if our sense of enoughness is always tied to the next thing, we live in permanent dissatisfaction. In psychology, this is known as the hedonic treadmill, a state where we adapt quickly to gains and return to a baseline of longing. The joy of achievement fades, the sparkle of novelty dulls, and still we run. But what if we stepped off the treadmill What if we sat down, not because we gave up, but because we woke up? The dog doesn't need to catch the tail. It only needs to realize it was never missing. Tonight, before sleep, ask yourself, what am I chasing that I already possess? What would happen if I stopped, even for one breath, and rested in what is already here? And as your eyes grow heavy, as your thoughts soften like grass under moonlight, remember this. Peace is not what we find when the chase ends. Peace is what we find when we no longer believe we must chase. Rest now. You are not behind. You are not lacking. You are home. Story 9. The Broken Bellin. A remote village tucked between emerald hills and morning mist. There stood an old temple known for its silence. Travelers came not for sermons or statues, but for one thing only, a great bronze bell that hung from the rafters of its main hall. For centuries the bell had been rung each dawn, its deep tone echoing through the valley like a blessing. They called it the voice of the mountain. The monks believed that the bell carried not just sound, but spirit, that its vibrations awakened the sleeping world, and reminded all who heard it that life, like sound, was fleeting, meant to be felt, not held. But one winter night, during a thunderstorm that tore through the hills with a fury unseen in decades, lightning struck the bell tower. The bell did not fall, but cracked thinly clearly from lip to crown. And when the morning came and a monk pulled the thick rope to ring it, the sound that came forth was wrong. It no longer sang. It shuddered. The tone, once round and full, now wavered like breath interrupted by sorrow. The villagers gathered below, confused. Some whispered it was a bad omen. Others urged the monks to melt it down and cast a new bell. But the abbot, an elderly man named Ryunin, refused. The bell still speaks, he said. We must learn to hear its new voice. The monks were divided. Some wanted to replace it. Others agreed with Ryunin, but no one touched the bell. Days passed, then weeks. The cracked bell hung in silence, draped with cloth, as if in mourning. One afternoon, a novice monk named Kento approached Ryunin in the courtyard. Master, he said, why do we leave the bell untouched if it no longer sings true? Ryunin smiled softly. What makes you think it no longer sings true? Kento frowned. Its sound is flawed, broken. Is it? Ryunin asked. Or is it simply honest? That night, Ryunin gathered the monks and struck the bell himself. Its voice rang out, through the cold air, wounded, yes, but haunting. The note bent slightly, like a cry wrapped in wind. It filled the valley not with grandeur, but with grief, and yet something in it drew people to stillness. Tears welled in the eyes of the elder monks, not because the bell was broken, but because it had become real. From that night on, the bell was rung each dawn and each dusk, not to declare perfection, but to remind all who heard it that even what is cracked can call the world to wakefulness. Tham, Buddha once said, if you are quiet enough, you will hear the sound of the universe in the broken things. Too often, we believe our value lies in flawlessness, that to be heard, we must be polished, that only what is whole is worthy of reverence. But Zen shows us something deeper. The crack in the bell was not its death, it was its second birth. Its voice changed, yes, but in that shift, it touched something older than beauty. Truth. In psychology, this touches on a profound insight, what we call post-traumatic growth. Not all healing returns us to who we were. Sometimes, healing creates something new, a deeper empathy, a quieter presence, a more resonant self. We may not sing the way we once did, but perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps the world doesn't need more perfect sounds. Perhaps it needs the honesty of a broken bell. In your own life, you may carry cracks, losses that still ache, choices that left scars, seasons where you fell out of tune with yourself. You may think these fractures silence you, make you less. But what if they make you more? What if the sound that now rises from within you, trembling, uncertain, real, is exactly what someone else needs to hear? Tonight, before sleep, ask yourself, what crack do I hide from the world, thinking it disqualifies me? And what might change if I let it ring, and as your thoughts begin to settle, your breath anchoring you in the gentle dark, remember this. Even the broken bell wakes the valley. You do not need to be whole to be heard. You only need the courage to sound. Story 10. The Empty Robe. The temple was quiet that morning. Fog clung to the stone paths like breath that refused to fade. The incense from morning prayers still lingered in the meditation hall, trailing in soft spirals through the beams of light that pierced the shoji screens. It was the kind of silence that held not absence but depth, like still water that hides the mountains it reflects. In a small room at the edge of the temple grounds, a young monk named Taiki stood before a mirror, holding his robe in both hands. His eyes were tired, his shoulders heavy. The robe, a deep grey with subtle gold stitching, had once filled him with quiet pride. It meant belonging. It meant transformation. It meant he had turned from the chaos of the world and chosen a life of inner clarity. But now, the robe felt heavier than his body. He had made a mistake. It was not dramatic. No fire. No scandal. Only a moment of weakness. Words spoken in anger. A broken promise. An old desire briefly indulged and then regretted. Yet to Taiki, it was enough to believe he had failed the path entirely. That he was no longer worthy of the robe he wore. He had not told anyone. Not yet. But this morning, as the fog rose like a veil, he had made his decision. He would leave the robe in the meditation hall, bow deeply, and disappear. He slipped quietly through the corridors and entered the hall. The others had gone to tend the gardens, their voices faint through the open windows. Taiki knelt at the altar, placed the robe before him and bowed low. He stayed there a long time. Then a familiar voice behind him said, "Are you offering thanks or farewell?" Taiki didn't look up. "Both," he whispered. Master Senzu stepped beside him and sat down. His presence was always unforced, like the way a mountain simply is. Taiki finally looked up, shame burning behind his eyes. "I don't deserve to wear this anymore." Senzu studied the robe for a long moment. "Tell me," he said quietly, "when this robe is empty, is it less sacred?" Taiki blinked. "When no one wears it," the master continued, "does it lose its meaning?" "No," Taiki said, "but it serves no purpose without a body." "True," Senzu said, "and yet it does not condemn the one who steps away. It does not cling. It waits. It forgives." Taiki swallowed hard. "But I failed." Senzu nodded gently. "And what do you think this robe was meant for?" "Perfection." The silence held them both. "This robe," the master said, lifting it, with both hands and placing it between them, "is not a badge of purity. It is a container for practice, for returning, for beginning again. Its emptiness is not shameful. It is sacred, because it reminds us that we are never fixed in our worst moments. We can step out. We can return. Tears welled in Taiki's eyes. But I wanted to be better. Senzu smiled, soft as fog. And now you are. They sat like that for a long time, two figures in silence, the robe between them not as symbol of shame, but of continuity. Eventually, Taiki lifted it again, folded it carefully, and pressed it to his chest. Not as a reward, but as a vow. That evening, he joined the others in the garden. No one asked where he had been. No one needed to. His presence had returned, fuller, quieter, truer. The Buddha once said, "As the snake sheds its skin, so must we shed our past again and again." But shedding is not abandoning. It is not rejecting who we were. It is seeing that even our worst moments are part of the fabric of awakening. That failure is not a break from the path. It is the path. In trauma work, this is called reintegration. The process of embracing the fractured parts of the self with compassion, not just healing the wound, but listening to it, making space for it, letting the shame dissolve in the light of presence. Modern culture tends to glorify fresh starts, new chapters, clean slates. But true transformation is messier. It does not erase, it includes, it asks, can I bring even this into the temple of my life? The robe may fall, you may step away, but the path waits with the same softness as before, because it was never about worthiness, only willingness. Tonight, before sleep, ask yourself, what part of myself have I exiled, believing it disqualifies me? Can I offer that part a seat beside me? Can I wear my life, not as proof of purity, but as practice? And as your breath slows, as your heart finds its rhythm again, remember this: the robe is empty not because you failed, but because it is always waiting for the one who is ready to return. Fold your shame gently, put it beside your breath, begin again. Story 11. The Cloud Over the Mountain. The mountains held the morning like a secret. Pale light draped the ridgelines in gentle silver, and the mist rolled in waves, softening everything it touched. In the quiet of the high temple, nestled among pines and crumbling stone lanterns, an old monk named Daiichi sat alone on the veranda, watching a single cloud drift across the face of the tallest peak. It was a familiar sight, one he had watched for decades, but today the cloud reminded him of something else, something heavier, closer to the heart. Behind him, the temple remained still. The novices were sweeping leaves in the courtyard, their quiet chatter trailing through the air like smoke. Somewhere in the kitchen, rice boiled over a low fire, and yet Daiichi did not move. His mind had wandered, not forward, not to planning or worry, but backward to a memory he rarely let surface. 40 years ago, before the robe, before the silence, before the vows, Daiichi had been a father. His son, Akio, had been small and curious, with a laugh that cracked like sunlight through clouds. Daiichi remembered the way he used to run barefoot through the grass, how he loved dragonflies and hated shoes, how he once said he could hear the moon whisper at night if the world got quiet enough. Then one day he was gone, a fever, a night, a silence that never truly ended. Daiichi had carried that silence with him when he came to the monastery. He had shaved his head not as a ritual, but as a burial. He took the vows not to find enlightenment, but to survive grief. And for years he had practiced like a man holding his breath. He became respected, wise, steady. But there was a part of him, a boy-shaped cloud, that never dissolved. This morning, watching the actual cloud drift over the peak, Daiichi whispered to it for the first time in years. "I still see you," he said. The wind did not answer, but something in his chest loosened. Later that day, a young novice named Now approached him. The boy had bright eyes and too many questions. Daiichi liked him for that. But today, Now was subdued. "Master," he asked, "what should I do when sadness comes without warning?" Daiichi looked at him carefully. "Let it pass," he said, "like a cloud over the mountain." Now frowned. "But what if it stays?" Then, Daiichi said, "Sit with it, offer it tea, let it tell its story." Now sat beside him, uncertain. "But I don't understand it. Sometimes I feel like I'm sad about something I don't even remember." Daiichi nodded slowly. "Some clouds come from storms long past. They still carry rain, even if we've forgotten where it fell." Now looked at the sky. "So we just watch them?" "Yes," Daiichi said. "We watch, and we breathe, and we trust that even when we can't see the mountain, it is still there." That night, after the temple had gone quiet, Daiichi walked alone to the meditation hall. He lit a single candle and sat on the worn cushion he had used for decades. But instead of reciting the sutras or counting breath, he simply placed his hand over his heart and whispered his son's name. No one heard, and yet something answered. The Buddha once said, "You will not be punished for your anger, your grief, your sorrow. You will be punished by your refusal to see them clearly." In Zen, we are not taught to escape our emotions, but to witness them. Not to fix them, but to let them move. To trust that, like weather, they do not define the sky. In trauma work, this is the essence of integration. Not repressing the past, nor being swallowed by it, but allowing it to live beside us with compassion. The grief that lingers is not a flaw. It is a tribute, a thread, a reminder that we have loved. But modern life often demands speed, productivity, smile through the pain. There is little space for grief that has no name, for sadness without context. And so, we shame the cloud, we fear it, but Zen says, let it be, let it pass, let it stay, let it rain. You are still the mountain. Tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, what cloud hangs quietly in my sky, unseen, unspoken, but present? Can I watch it without pushing it away? Can I honor it by simply staying still beneath it? And as your breath slows, and the thoughts begin to quiet, like dusk falling on the ridge, remember this: even when the mountain is hidden, it does not disappear. It remains, still, whole, patient. You do not need to be clear. You do not need to be free of sadness. You only need to stay and let the cloud drift by. Story 12. The feather on the river. It was the end of summer when the river thinned. The rains had passed, and the stones that once slept beneath water now lay bare in the sun, their rounded backs glistening like the shells of turtles. At dawn, a light mist curled along the surface of the water, and dragonflies skimmed low, dancing between reeds that swayed in quiet agreement. Down by the riverbank, a boy sat watching. His name was Ren. He had come to the monastery not by choice, but by consequence. His mother had died. His father had vanished. He was 13, angry and silent. The monks gave him space. They fed him, clothed him, and let him follow their routines. But Ren remained distant, like a door left half closed, daring no one to knock. He rarely spoke, but he watched. And that morning, he watched the river, knees pulled to his chest, chin resting on folded arms. His eyes were tired in the way only a child who had seen too much could carry. Master Senzu noticed him there. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he knelt a few paces away and traced a circle in the sand with his finger. Then, as if by design, a soft breeze stirred and carried a single feather, white and weightless, down from the trees. It landed on the river, spinning slowly, and began to float downstream. Ren followed it with his eyes. Senzu said nothing. Not at first. Then, gently, he asked, "Have you ever tried to hold water in your fist?" Ren shook his head. "If you try," Senzu said, "you'll find that the tighter you squeeze, the faster it escapes. But if you open your hand, let it rest, it may stay a little longer." Ren said nothing, but his gaze didn't leave the feather. "It's the same with pain," the master continued. "The more we grasp at it, deny it, analyze it, try to make it fit our story, the more it slips through us and returns. But if we let it float, just float, it begins to soften." Ren shifted. "But what if it never leaves?" Senzu nodded. "Some things don't. Some sorrows become part of us, but they don't have to define how we move. They can sit beside us like the feather on the river, carried, not clutched." Ren looked down, his throat tightening. "I hate that I can't forget." To this, Senzu answered, "Then don't, but don't keep trying to remember it the same way." The river moved slowly, and the feather continued to glide, effortless. In the weeks that followed, Ren still rarely spoke, but he changed, not with dramatic words or sudden smiles, but in the way he walked a little more upright, in how he helped a younger novice tie his robe, in how he stayed behind after morning meditation to sweep the steps just a little longer than required. He began to carve small wooden birds from driftwood, placing them along the garden walls like secret prayers. And he visited the river each morning, watching for feathers. The grief was still there, but it no longer drowned him. He had learned to let it move. The Buddha once said, "You can only lose what you cling to." This teaching, often misunderstood, is not a call to detach from life or abandon feeling, but to stop binding ourselves to the story we tell about the pain, to let it be what it is, a current, not a chain. In trauma therapy, this is akin to emotional decentering, allowing an experience to exist without fusing your identity to it. Instead of "I am broken," one says, "There is pain in me." Instead of "I cannot move on," one says, "I will move, and the pain may come with me." It shifts the relationship. The feather floats, the river carries, and still we breathe. Many people hold tight to past wrongs, regrets, guilt, or grief, not because they want to suffer, but because they fear forgetting means letting go of love, or meaning, or justice. But holding too tightly turns memory into anchor. Zen teaches us to let things come and let them go, to be the river and the watcher, to see each thought, each ache, each joy as the feather, soft, temporary, passing. Tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, what sorrow or memory am I gripping too tightly? Can I place it gently on the river, even if it's only for one breath? And as your breath slows and the hush of night settles across your skin, remember this: the river remembers nothing, and yet it carries everything. Let your pain float. Let your love float. Let yourself, even if only once, be the feather, and trust the river to hold you. Story 13. The three fires in the heart of a dense forest where sunlight filtered through layers of ancient trees, there stood a secluded Zen monastery known as Sankaji, the Temple of Three Fires. Few knew how the temple earned its name, and fewer still spoke of it. The name was whispered among monks as a riddle, passed down without explanation, like a flame handed from candle to candle. The monastery had no elaborate architecture. Its wooden beams creaked. Its walls were worn thin by time. And yet, the silence, there held a strange weight, as if the air remembered something most had forgotten. At the edge of the compound lived a monk named Yorin, known for his discipline and solitude. He kept to himself, waking before the bell, eating in silence, meditating for long hours beneath a maple tree whose red leaves whispered like small truths. He was respected, but not approachable. Yorin was battling three things no one could see. The first was anger, a deep, burning ember that flared whenever he remembered his brother, who had betrayed him in their youth and left him to bear shame alone. The second was greed, not for wealth, but for recognition. Every time the abbot praised another monk, Yorin's chest tightened. He wanted to be the one, the example, the embodiment of Zen. The third was delusion, a quiet belief that he had transcended all this, that his anger, his craving, his blindness were behind him. But they were not behind him. They burned. One evening, as dusk stained the trees with molten gold, the temple bell rang once, then fell silent. A novice rushed into the meditation hall, breathless. "Fire!" he cried. "In the old archive!" Monks leapt into action. Buckets, cloths, shovels, feet pounded against wood, voices rose, and smoke coiled into the sky like a serpent set free. Yorin ran to the archive building, small, unused, filled with ancient scrolls and brittle paper. Flames licked the corners of the walls. The heat was growing. Smoke stung his eyes. And yet, inside that inferno, he saw something that made him freeze. A wooden statue. It had once belonged to the founder of the monastery, a carving of Canon, the bodhisattva of compassion. Worn smooth with age, it stood on a pedestal, now surrounded by smoke and fire. Without thinking, Yorin rushed into the building. Flames cracked above him. He grabbed the statue, turned, and a beam fell, catching the edge of his robe, dragging him to the ground. Pain seared through his shoulder. A younger monk ran in and pulled him out just in time. They both tumbled into the dirt, coughing, covered in ash. The statue lay beside them, blackened but intact. Yorin sat in the dirt, clutching his shoulder, eyes wide. Not from the fire, but from something else. A realization. The three fires were not in the building. They were in him. His anger had driven him to prove himself. His pride had made him charge into the blaze alone. His delusion had whispered, "You must save the symbol, or you are nothing." And in doing so, he had nearly lost everything. Later that night, wrapped in bandages and seated by the same maple tree, Yorin wept, not for his wound, not for the fire, but for the truth that had found him at last. The next morning, he did something he had never done before. He spoke. To every monk gathered. In the meditation hall, he confessed, not just his actions, but his emotions. The resentment, the jealousy, the need to be seen. He offered no excuses, only breath, only stillness, only truth. And then he bowed, not low out of formality, but fully, forehead to the ground, in surrender. No one said a word. They didn't need to. From that day forward, Yorin's presence changed. He laughed gently. He asked questions. He walked more slowly. The fire in him still flickered, but it no longer consumed. He had stopped feeding it. The Buddha once said, "There are three fires that burn in the mind: the fire of craving, the fire of aversion, and the fire of ignorance. Extinguish these, and you are free. These are not metaphorical ideas. They are real. They live in the tight jaw after a slight, in the ache for validation, in the stories we spin about ourselves that make us feel bigger or smaller than our modern psychology names these impulses too: fight, flight, freeze, anger, addiction, denial. But Zen goes further. It doesn't pathologize them. It makes them teachers. To extinguish the fires, you must first feel their heat. You must step into the hall of smoke and say, I see you, not to control, not to punish, but to stop adding fuel, to sit beside the burning and say, you may burn, but I will not feed you anymore. Tonight, before sleep, ask yourself, what fire do I keep feeding, hoping it will warm me when all it does is burn? Can I let it cool? Not by fighting it, but by understanding it. And as your eyes close and the world softens, remember this: the fire dies not in darkness, but in stillness. Let yourself cool. Let the flames lower. And in the quiet ash, you may find something softer than heat. You may find peace. Story 14. The Wounded Tree. At the edge of the monastery grounds, where the forest pressed close like a quiet listener, there stood an old maple tree. It was not the tallest nor the most beautiful, but it was the most remembered because it had survived the lightning. Years ago, during the monsoon season, a storm had rolled down from the northern peaks with violent force. Thunder cracked the sky open, and rain slammed the earth like fists. In the middle of that storm, a bolt of lightning split the maple's trunk. Flames licked its heartwood, and its branches fell like broken limbs onto the soaked ground. When morning came, the monks expected to find a smouldering stump. But the tree had not fallen. Blackened, bent, wounded, it still stood. It didn't bloom the following spring, or the next. Some said it was only a matter of time. But by the third year, one small leaf appeared near the base, then two, then more. Now, a decade later, the tree bore its scars openly. A deep, charred line still ran down its trunk, and one side leaned inward like a monk in bow. But each spring, it bloomed anyway. A young nun named Amy often sat by the tree. She had come to the monastery only 6 months earlier, her smile too, careful, her laughter hesitant. No one pressed her for her story. It would come in time, or not at all. But they noticed how she always chose the wounded tree. She would sit beneath it in the early morning, fingers resting lightly on its roots, as if asking for permission. She never chanted, never spoke, just breathed, her eyes closed, her face tilted toward the light that filtered through the leaves. One morning, Master Senzu passed by and stopped. Amy opened her eyes, surprised, and offered a small bow. "You visit this tree often," he said. Amy nodded. "Why?" he asked, not as interrogation, but with the curiosity of a man who truly wanted to listen. She looked up at the jagged trunk, at the wound still etched like memory through its bark. "Because it didn't pretend it wasn't hurt," she said. Senzu smiled. He sat beside her without a word. They stayed like that a long time. Later that day, Amy approached the abbot's hall and spoke her story. She told of years spent in a home where silence was survival, of hands that bruised instead of held, of the way she learned to shrink herself to stay safe, of how, even now, she sometimes flinched at sudden sounds, at raised voices, at kindness. And then she said, with a voice like a cracking branch, "I thought I was broken." The abbot listened. Then he said, "There is a kind of tree that grows, stronger in its scars. Not because it forgets, but because it adapts. The fibers realign, the roots deepen, the shape changes, but it still grows toward light. From that day on, Amy began to join the daily chanting. Her voice was soft but steady. She helped in the kitchen. She smiled more easily, though still with a touch of caution, and each week she planted a new sapling somewhere near the forest's edge, each one carefully marked with a red thread around the stem, one for each part of herself she was reclaiming. The Buddha once said, "Just as a solid rock is not shaken by the wind, so the wise are not shaken by blame or praise. But wisdom does not mean untouched. It means unbroken. It means we feel the fire and still rise from the ash, not unchanged, but more real." In modern trauma work, we speak of resilience, integration, and post-traumatic growth. But what Zen teaches, in its quiet way, is even older than those words. That pain is not a flaw to fix, but a truth to carry gently. That healing is not a return to who we were, but the unfolding of who we are now. You may carry wounds, scars, both seen and hidden, but you still stand, still breathe, still grow. You may not bloom the way others do, but bloom you will, because the wound does not disqualify you from the path. It is the path. Tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, what scar do I still treat as shame? Can I instead treat it as proof that I survived and that I'm still becoming? And as you breathe in the hush of the night, feel this truth take root. The tree does not apologize for its wound. It lets the birds nest there. Let your wounds be shelter. Let your story stand. You do not need to be whole to be holy. You only need to keep growing. Story 15. The fisherman who cried to the sea. The village of Nami no Kawa lay nestled between mountains and tide, where salt air clung to door frames, and the wind carried both gossip and prayer. The people there lived by the sea, with faces weathered, like driftwood and hearts shaped by the tides. At dawn, nets were cast. At dusk, fish were salted, dried, weighed, traded. Life came and went on the backs of waves. Among the villagers was a fisherman named Toma. He was once known for his laughter, his booming voice that echoed across the docks, his songs that carried over the water as he rowed. His small boat, painted red and black, had seen more fish than any in the village, but now it sat idle, tied loosely to a post, swaying in silence. Toma no longer sang. No one knew what to say. A year earlier, his son, his only child, had drowned in a sudden squall while learning to cast alone. The sea, which had given Toma everything, had taken what he loved most. He had not spoken much since. Each morning, before the sun broke the horizon, Toma walked barefoot down to the shoreline. He stood where water met sand, unmoving, staring into the vastness as if daring the sea to return what it had taken. His shoulders were always tense, his eyes always wet. He never went fishing again, he simply stood. And sometimes, in the hush before the village stirred, his voice could be heard, not singing, but crying, low, guttural, as if calling out not to be heard, but because silence was heavier. One morning, Master Senzu visited the village. He had come for salt, but lingered when he heard of Toma. After speaking briefly with the village elder, he walked alone to the shore and found the fisherman, in his usual place, eyes fixed on the horizon. Senzu said nothing. He simply stood beside him. The sea rolled in. After a time, he asked gently, "You come here every morning?" Toma didn't look at him. "Yes." "Why?" "To remember." Senzu nodded. "And does it help?" Toma's jaw clenched. "It doesn't bring him back. No, Senzu said, but perhaps it brings you back to him. Toma turned, eyes narrowed. What would a monk know about loss? Senzu did not flinch. I know it does not respond to reason. I know it lives in the body, long after it leaves the mind. I know the sea does not apologize. And I know silence, when we fight it, becomes sorrow. They stood in the rising light, gulls wheeling above. After a while, Senzu stepped closer to the water and reached into his sleeve, pulling out a small folded paper boat. He knelt, placed it gently on the waves, and let it drift. Toma watched. Senzu turned to him. Say his name. What? Say his name, out loud. Toma hesitated. His throat tightened. Sutta, he finally whispered. Again. Toma blinked. Sota. Again. This time, it broke. Sutta! The name collapsed into sobs, into a keening that bent Toma's spine, that brought him to his knees. He clutched the sand, the salt water mixing with his tears, and the sea took none of it back. But it received it. Completely. Senzu stood beside him, eyes closed, bowing not with his body, but with his breath. They stayed there until the tide began to pull back, and Toma, still kneeling, looked up. The paper boat was still visible, a small dot floating gently, as if carrying a name the world had tried to forget. After that day, Toma still came to the shore, but he began to bring offerings, a piece of fruit, a folded crane, a shell. He didn't cry every time, but when he did, it no longer broke him. It softened him. One morning, he returned to his boat, repaired the nets, scrubbed the paint, and, before setting out again, he whispered into the wind, "Come with me, Sutta." And perhaps he did. The Buddha once said, "You will not be punished for your grief, but you will be freed when you no longer push it away." Zen does not ask us to forget. It does not tell us that pain is illusion. It tells us that pain, like the tide, belongs. That sorrow, like salt, flavors the soul. That grief is not a mistake. It is love's echo. Modern psychology speaks of continuing bonds, the healthy integration of lost loved ones into our living narrative. We do not move on from grief. We grow around it. We carry it with tenderness, like a scar that no longer aches every day, but still tells us we once lived deeply. Toma did not heal by letting go of his son. He healed by learning to speak to him. Again, not to demand, not to resist, but to remember, to include him in the silence. Tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, who have I lost that I still hold in silence? Can I speak their name with gentleness? Can I let my tears be offerings, not evidence of weakness? And as your breath deepens, as the waves of thought begin to slow, remember this. The sea does not give back what it takes, but it will carry what we offer if we let it go with love. Say the name, fold the paper boat, let it float. Story 16. The Sand Mandala. The hall was silent except for the sound of soft grains falling, tiny clicks of colour landing gently on wood. 5 monks sat in a perfect circle, bent over a low platform. Each held a chakpur, a narrow metal funnel, and with delicate taps of a thin rod, they coaxed sand through its tip in steady streams. Red, yellow, green, white. Layer by layer, stroke by stroke, the mandala took shape, a wheel of fire, a lotus of compassion, a palace with no doors. They had been building it for 7 days. It was nearly complete. Visitors came to watch in respectful silence. Children leaned forward on their knees, entranced. Even birds quieted on the rooftop beams. Among the visitors stood Hana, a woman in her early 40s, her hands clasped behind her back. Her eyes were heavy with fatigue, not from lack of sleep, but from the long ache of a life she no longer knew how to carry. She had come to the temple not seeking wisdom, but escape. Her marriage had ended months earlier, not with rage or betrayal, but with exhaustion. Years of trying to fix, to forgive, to forget, and then, finally, to let go. She had not cried during the divorce. She had not screamed or broken dishes, but something in her had cracked quietly and permanently. Now, she stood watching monks build beauty from nothing but dust, only to erase it again. That was the part she couldn't understand. On the 8th morning, the mandala was finished. It was exquisite, layers of symmetry, symbols of galaxies, gates to sacred realms, each curve breathing stillness. The abbot came forward, bowed, and stood with his palms pressed together. Hana turned to the monk beside her and whispered, "What happens now?" He smiled gently. "They destroy it." Her brow creased. "Why?" "To remember." She said nothing, but her fingers curled inward. The ceremony began. The monks picked up brushes. Slow, deliberate strokes. Lines were smeared, borders dissolved. Patterns blurred into chaos. Colors merged into brown. In under an hour, the mandala was gone. The sand was gathered in a copper bowl, carried to the river, and poured into the current with a chant of farewell. Hana watched every moment. Later that day, she found the abbot in the garden. He was watering, a small fig tree, humming to himself. "I don't understand," she said. "Why spend so much time creating something just to let it go?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, he said, "Tell me, have you ever lost something you loved?" She looked down. "Yes." "And did you love it less because it ended?" "No." He nodded. "That is the lesson." She sat beside him. "It hurts," she whispered. "Yes," he said. "Because you built something beautiful, and now it's gone, just like the mandala. But that doesn't make it meaningless. It makes it sacred." She was silent for a long time. Then she asked, "What do I do now?" He dipped his hand into the watering pail and let the droplets fall between them. "Begin again," he said. "The Buddha once taught, all conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with heedfulness. Impermanence is not a tragedy, it is the truth. We suffer not because things end, but because we believed they wouldn't. We cling. We tighten. We make permanent what was always passing." In psychology, grief is often complicated by the inability to let go of the form of something, the relationship, the career, the role, the identity. But Zen invites us to go deeper, to release not only what we've lost, but the illusion that we were ever in control of keeping it. The mandala is not destroyed to diminish its beauty. It is destroyed to reveal that its beauty was never in its permanence. It was in the making, the breathing, the being. Your life is the same. Your love, your joy, your pain. Each one a grain of sand placed with care. You build, you bless, you bow, and then you let it go. And in letting go, you are free to begin again. Tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, what am I still holding on to because I fear the emptiness beneath it? Can I honor it and still let it wash into the river. And as your breath slows and the night unfolds like a canvas of quiet stars, remember this: to create is sacred. To destroy with love is liberation. Scatter the sand, bless the dust, and when the dawn comes, begin again. Story 17. The Bridge with No Name. There was a bridge in the hills of Kiso that no one named. It arched gracefully over a quiet stream, nestled between two moss-covered cliffs. Simple in design, built of dark cypress and stone, it bore no inscriptions, no signs, no prayers etched into wood. No one remembered who had built it. No one claimed ownership, and yet the villagers called it sacred, not because of legends or miracles, but because of how they felt while crossing it. The moment your foot touched the first plank, something changed. The air shifted, the mind stilled. The weight you carried, grief, worry, desire, eased, just a little. People slowed their steps, lowered their voices. Some even removed their shoes out of instinct, not rule. When asked why, the elders would simply say, "Because the bridge does not know who we are." And so, it accepts everyone. One day, a scholar named Ichiro came to the temple nearby. He had spent his life studying Zen scriptures, traveling from monastery to monastery, amassing knowledge the way some men collect coins. He could quote the Diamond Sutra by memory, debate emptiness and form for hours, and write essays dense with Sanskrit and metaphor. But something still eluded him. He felt it at night, when the text closed and silence grew too thick. A gnawing hollowness, like he had studied the moon his entire life, but never looked up to see it. He heard of the bridge from a tea seller on the road. "It is only wood," the man said, "but it teaches better than books." Intrigued, Ichiro made the detour. When he reached the edge of the bridge, he stopped. A strange sensation overtook him. Like standing in front of a temple, not built by hands, he hesitated, then stepped forward. Halfway across, he paused. Suddenly, his mind felt nameless. He could no longer remember his credentials, his lineage, his reputation. None of it seemed to matter. He was not a scholar here, not even a monk, just a man on a bridge, breathing. He crossed in silence, and when he reached the other side, he sat beneath a cedar and wept, not from sorrow, but from release. That night, he returned to the temple and asked to speak with Master Senzu. They sat by candlelight. "I have studied every teaching," Ichiro said, "but today, a bridge taught me what I could never grasp." Senzu smiled, pouring tea into 2 small cups. "Then the bridge has done what no teacher can." Ichiro nodded slowly. "It asked nothing of me, and so I gave everything." Senzu handed him the cup. "Sometimes," he said, "we must walk through spaces that do not reflect back who we think we are, so that we can finally see who we truly are beneath it all." In Zen, identity is one of the deepest attachments. The self we defend, the role we play, the mask we polish. We cling to names: student, teacher, victim, hero, believing they define us, but they don't. They describe a moment, not the soul beneath it. Modern psychology echoes this in the concept of ego detachment, the ability to observe the roles we inhabit without confusing them for our true essence. We are not our profession, our pain, our past. We are not the stories others tell about us. We are not even the stories we tell ourselves. We are breath. We are presence. We are the space between the steps. That bridge, unnamed, accepts all because it mirrors none, and in doing so, it frees the one who crosses it from the need to be anyone at all. Ask yourself now, what name am I still trying to live up to? What role am I afraid to lay down? Can I walk for one breath without needing to be anyone? And as the night deepens and the edges of your identity soften like mist on old wood, remember this: the bridge asks for no name, only your presence. Walk it slowly. Forget who you were. Remember what you are. Story 18. The candle in the cave far, beyond the temple walls, past fields of millet and groves of persimmon trees, there lay a winding path that few ever followed. It climbed into the forested hills, curved along sheer cliffs, and disappeared into the mouth of a cave, a place untouched by time, where light rarely entered and silence clung to the stone like a second skin. The monks called it Shomyaku, the pulse of stillness. No one lived there. No one meditated there regularly. It was a place visited in rare moments, when the noise within became louder than the world outside. That's why Riku went. He was only 16, the youngest novice in the monastery, but he carried within him a storm no one could see. His smile was practiced, his chanting precise. But his nights were restless, his chest often tight. He felt like an intruder in his own body, distracted, scattered, filled with questions he didn't know how to ask. Why can't I feel peace? Like the others? Why is my mind always racing? Why do I feel so alone, even among the quiet? One evening, after a meditation sit where his legs trembled and his thoughts raced like wild horses, he approached Master Senzu. "I think something's wrong with me," he said. Senzu looked at him gently. "Why do you believe that?" "Because I do everything they say. I sit, I breathe, I recite, but my thoughts won't stop. I feel lost." Senzu nodded slowly. Then he placed a single candle in the boy's hand and said, "Go to the cave." Riku blinked. "Alone?" "Of course," the master said. "That is the only way we meet the dark." So he went. It took half a day to reach the mouth of the cave. By then, the sky had begun to dim, and the shadows stretched long over the rocks. Riku lit the candle, stepped inside, kept walking. The air cooled. The stone walls narrowed. Soon, the entrance disappeared behind him, swallowed by black. He found a flat place, set the candle on a ledge, and sat. The flame flickered gently, casting soft circles of light that danced along the rough walls. Around it, the darkness seemed infinite, but the flame, small, steady, held its space. For a while, Riku simply watched it. His thoughts came as they always did. Memories, fantasies, self-judgments, waves of unease. But the candle did not react. It just burned. Silent. Present. Eventually, something shifted. Riku realized that the candle did not need to defeat the dark. It only needed to shine. It was not there to control the cave. It was there to reveal that, within the silence, he was not alone. Tears came, not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time, he felt he didn't need to fix the darkness. He only needed to sit with it and let the candle be enough. He stayed the night, slept lightly, waking often. But each time he opened his eyes, the candle's glow met him, patient, unchanged. When dawn arrived, the light from outside began to seep back in, dimming the flame's glow. Riku blew it out. The cave did not feel as heavy anymore. As he walked back to the temple, he no longer felt like someone chasing peace. He felt like someone learning how to keep company with himself. The Buddha once said, "A single candle can light 1,000 others, and its life will not be shortened." Happiness never decreases by being shared, but sometimes the candle is not meant to be shared, not yet. Sometimes it is meant to be held quietly, in a room no one sees, where your own presence is enough. Modern life pushes us to perform wellness, smile, show improvement, achieve serenity. But Zen invites us to sit in the cave, with the candle, and ask nothing but truth. Psychologically, this mirrors the healing of self-acceptance, the practice of observing our thoughts and emotions without judgment, without needing to fix, escape, or deny, to simply say, I see you. You are allowed to be here. Riku did not return as a boy who had mastered his mind. He returned as someone who had made peace with the part of him that could not be silenced, and that made all the difference. Tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, what darkness have I been trying to eliminate? Can I instead sit beside it and offer it the warmth of my attention? And as your eyes begin to close and the cave of sleep welcomes you in, remember this. The candle is not afraid of the dark. It simply shines. So too can you, small. Quiet. Enough. Story 19. The mirror that shattered. The temple had a mirror. It hung in a quiet corridor outside the monks' quarters, framed in dark cherry wood, polished each morning by one of the novices. It wasn't ornate or large, just wide enough to catch, a reflection from the chest up. But over the years, it had become something of a ritual for the monks to pause there as they passed, not to admire themselves, but to observe the face that arose with each new day. They did not look to correct or adjust. They looked to see. One rainy morning, the mirror shattered. No one knew exactly how, a gust of wind perhaps, a robe brushing too roughly. But when the monks came to breakfast, they found it in pieces, sharp fragments scattered across the wooden floor, reflecting not faces now, but ceilings, floorboards, sky. The youngest monk, Hiro, stared in dismay. Should we replace it? He asked. Master Senzu, who had just arrived with his walking stick and a quiet gaze, looked at the fragments. No, he said. We'll leave it. And so they did. They swept the shards into a wide wooden tray and placed them in the meditation hall. At first, it seemed strange, sitting there with bits of glass reflecting odd angles of the room, fractured bits of skin, eyes, robes. But as days passed, something unexpected happened. Each monk, at some point, sat before the tray and saw themselves differently. Hiro was the first to speak. In the broken mirror, he said, my face looks less like a face and more like a constellation. Senzu nodded. It is no longer one thing. The others agreed. In the shards, they saw emotion in pieces, tension in the jaw, softness in the eyes, sadness behind a smile. They saw more truth in the brokenness than they had in the whole. Eventually, it became a new practice, sitting before the fragments each morning, not to confirm identity, but to examine illusion. One day, Hiro asked the master, why does the broken mirror show more than the unbroken one? Senzu replied, because when we look into something whole, we expect to see something whole. But when it is broken, we stop trying to recognize. We begin to observe. Hiro sat with this for a while. Then he whispered, like looking at the self? Senzu smiled. Exactly. In Buddhism, we speak of anatta, the doctrine of no self. It doesn't mean we don't exist. It means the self we cling to, the identity, the story, the label, is not as fixed or real as we believe. Like a mirror, it shows something but does not contain it. And when that mirror breaks, we have a chance to see what lies beneath the reflection. In modern psychology, this moment of fragmentation is often seen in crisis, the breakup, the illness, the job loss, the moment when who we thought we were no longer fits. We panic. We try to glue the mirror back together. But Zen suggests, wait, sit, look. The cracks may reveal something new, a self less bound by labels, a truth not in the surface, but in the pattern of reflection. You are not only what appears in the glass, you are the one who sees it, and the one who changes when no one is looking. That month, none of the monks asked for a new mirror. The tray of shards remained, a reminder that the self is never one piece. That identity is a process, not a possession. That what we are is too vast to be held in a single frame. Tonight, before sleep, ask yourself, what part of me am I trying to hold together so others can see a whole? What might I learn if I let the image fall apart? And as your breath settles into the quiet space between thoughts, remember this: the mirror did not break to punish you. It broke to show you what cannot be broken. Let the pieces reflect. Let the image shift. You are not just what you see. You are the seeing itself. Story 20. The Garden of Silence. The garden was unlike the others. Tucked behind the western wall of the monastery, it had no statues, no fountain, no stone paths. Just a circle of wild grass, moss-covered rocks, a few wind-blown trees, and scattered clusters of lavender and white clover. It wasn't carefully raked or symmetrically trimmed like the meditation garden near the main hall. There were no signs, no gates, no rules. And yet the monks called it Enmei no Niwa, the Garden of Silence. It was said that the first abbot, a man of few words and fewer gestures, had once pointed to the patch of earth and said, "Let it be," and so they did. Decades passed. The other gardens bloomed and faded with the seasons and the hands of caretakers. But this one remained untended, and it became holy in its own way. Visitors often passed it without notice. But those who sat there, even once, never forgot. One afternoon, a new monk named Koji wandered behind the western wall. He had arrived only a month earlier, his heart weighed down by restlessness. Not anxiety exactly, something deeper, a kind of constant hum beneath. His ribs, like a question he couldn't articulate. He followed the rules. He bowed, he sat, he recited. But silence, instead of soothing him, made him feel more distant from himself. That day, Koji didn't mean to find the garden. He was simply looking for a place to breathe. When he stepped into the wild circle, he felt something pause, not outside, but within. The wind rustled gently through the trees. A bird called out, then fell quiet. Even the insects buzzed in soft rhythms, as though keeping time with his chest. He sat down, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't try to meditate. He didn't adjust his posture, didn't count his breath, didn't reach for calm. He just listened, not to any sound in particular, but to everything at once. His thoughts rose. He didn't push them away. They fell. He didn't chase them. Something softened. It was as if the garden had no demand. It didn't ask him to be holy. It didn't ask him to be calm. It just asked him to be there. When Master Senzu passed by later that evening, he saw Koji still seated in the tall grass, unmoving. The master didn't speak. He only bowed and continued walking. The next morning, Koji sought out the master. "What is this place?" he asked. Senzu poured tea into 2 cups. You tell me, Koji thought for a long moment. It's a place where nothing judges me. Senzu smiled. And where do you think that silence comes from? Koji looked down. Maybe from me? Exactly, Senzu said. You did not enter a quiet garden. The garden revealed your own quiet. In Zen, silence is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of resistance. It is the space where nothing is pushed or pulled, where the world no longer needs to be different for you to rest. Modern life mistakes silence for emptiness, for boredom, for lack. But true silence is full, alive. It holds all things gently, like a bowl too vast to overflow. In mindfulness, we're taught to notice the moment. But in Zen, we're also taught to dissolve the one who notices, not to disappear, but to soften the boundaries of self until there is no separation between watcher and watched. That's what Koji discovered, not a quiet garden, but a quiet within. Over the weeks, he returned often. He said nothing about it, but others began to notice that when Koji walked, his steps no longer carried urgency. When he sat, his presence filled the room without weight, and when he bowed not out of duty, but as if greeting something sacred in the silence between breaths. The garden never changed, but Koji did, and in time, so did those who sat beside him. The Buddha once said, "Silence is an empty space. Space is the home of the awakened mind. It is not found, it is uncovered." Tonight, before sleep, ask yourself, where in my life have I mistaken silence for emptiness, when perhaps it is the very fullness I've been seeking? Can I sit with that quiet, not to escape, but to return? And as your thoughts soften and the night deepens like a garden untouched, remember this: you do not enter silence. Silence enters you when you are finally still enough to receive it. Let it enter. Let it hold you. Say nothing. You've already arrived. Story 21. The old monk's footprints. The snow had come early that year, blanketing the monastery in a hush so complete it seemed even the birds chose silence. Icicles clung like crystal beads to the eaves, and the bamboo fences wore thin white robes. The wind was soft but sharp, slicing gently through the gaps between walls and bones. In the stillness of dawn, a line of footprints appeared in the snow. They began at the meditation hall, curved through the stone path by the garden, and disappeared at the base of the northern hill. The prints were slow and wide-spaced, measured, like the gait of someone who no longer rushed. No one saw them being made, but all knew who they belonged to. They were the steps of Master Jikan. He was the oldest monk in the monastery, older even than the abbot. He no longer led ceremonies or taught sutras. His back curved like a willow branch, and his hands trembled when he poured tea. But his eyes remained sharp, like still water that had seen the reflection of many moons. Some of the younger novices believed he was no longer lucid. He spoke little, and when he did, it was in fragments, often pointing to the sky or smiling at shadows. Yet those who had sat with him in silence said otherwise. They said his silence spoke in whole sentences. They said his presence was warmer than fire. That morning, a young novice named Aito followed the tracks. He had noticed Master Jikan leave just after the temple bell. No coat, no staff, just a straw hat and the thin robes of winter. Aito had only been at the temple for a year. He was eager, disciplined, and full of questions he never dared ask. But he had watched the old monk closely, watched how he bowed to empty corners, how he paused to touch the bark of trees as if greeting old friends, how he lingered in places no one else noticed. Something about Jikan made Ito curious, not about the master, but about himself. Following the trail, Ito climbed the hill slowly. The snow deepened. The wind sang. Near the summit, the footprints stopped, and there sat Jikan, cross-legged on a stone, hat placed beside him, eyes closed, face turned toward the pale rising sun. Ito hesitated, then sat beside him. For a long while, there was no sound but breath. Then Jikan spoke, softly but clearly. "Did you come looking for me?" Ito blushed. "Yes." "I was worried." Jikan opened his eyes and smiled. "I leave footprints," he said, "so that someone might find their own." Ito frowned gently. "I don't understand." Jikan turned to him. "When I was young, I followed the footsteps of others. I wanted to walk where the great monks walked, to sit where they sat, to become what they were." He paused. "But now, I walk not to be followed. I walk to remind others they have their own path." Ato's breath caught in the cold air. "But how do we know it's the right one?" Jikan reached out and touched the snow. "You don't. That's the point. You walk anyway, and eventually the snow will remember you." They sat like that until the sun warmed the ice into steam and the footprints behind them began to melt. Later that spring, when the snow had gone and plum blossoms returned to the branches, Jikan passed away quietly in his sleep. At his funeral, the monks shared memories. Some spoke of his silence, others of his strange habits. But Ito did not speak. Instead, he walked alone up the same hill. At the summit, he sat where Jikan once sat, placed his palms on the stone, and whispered, "I'm ready now." And then he stood, turned, and walked, not in Jikan's path, but beside it. The Buddha once said, "No one saves us but ourselves. No one can, and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path." Zen does not offer you answers. It offers you space. It gives you a cushion, a breath, and an invitation. See for yourself. In modern psychology, we seek frameworks, labels, diagnoses, tools to navigate the self. But healing, at its core, is personal, unique, a journey not mapped by the steps of others, but by your own uncertain footprints through the wilderness of mind and heart. The old monk did not leave wisdom in words. He left it in silence, in presence, in prints that melted not because they were forgotten, but because they had served their purpose. Tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, whose footsteps am I still trying to fit into? And what might I find if I began to trust the shape of my own stride? And as the quiet of the night settles gently over you, like snow over stone, remember this: the path is not ahead of you. It is beneath you, forming with each step. Walk, and let the silence mark the way. Story 22. The boat with a hole in. A quiet fishing village wrapped between green cliffs and the endless blue of the sea. There was an old dock, weathered grey by time. It creaked under each footstep and swayed with the tide like a dream not yet finished. Tied to the end of the dock was a small wooden boat, slightly crooked, its hull patched in places with mismatched planks. The villagers called it Kibo, hope. It hadn't sailed in years. Once the boat belonged to a man named Sota, a fisherman known for his gentle nature and steady hands. He had built Kibo with his father, plank by plank, years ago. Together, they had caught enough fish to feed the village through lean winters, and in the quiet between tides, they'd sit on the boat and speak of nothing and everything. But after his father died, and the sea took a dear friend in a sudden storm, Sota began to avoid the water, not out of fear, but from something harder to name. The grief hollowed him quietly. His boat remained tied to the dock, slowly gathering barnacles and whispers. "I just need time," he'd say. But seasons passed. The paint peeled. The oars cracked. And then, one summer, a boy came to the village. No one knew much about him. He was perhaps 10 or 11. His name was Haru. He spoke little, but wandered everywhere, barefoot, curious, and always watching. It was said he had come from the city with distant relatives after losing his parents in a fire. Sota saw himself in the boy, the same quiet sadness, the same way he looked out at the horizon like it held an answer he couldn't reach. One morning, Sota found Haru sitting in kaibo, his legs dangling over the side. "You'll fall," Sota called gently. Haru shrugged. "Then I'll swim." Sota walked to the edge of the dock and sat beside the boy. After a moment, he asked, "Why do you come here?" Haru didn't answer at first. Then he said, "Because it feels safe." Sota smiled sadly. "Even though the boat's broken?" Haru looked up. "It still floats." Sota paused. He hadn't noticed that. Even after years with all its flaws and rot, the boat still floated. That evening, Sota returned with a lantern and tools. He examined the hull. There was a small hole near the stern. Not large enough to sink the boat immediately, but enough to let the sea in over time. He considered fixing it, then hesitated. Instead, he climbed in and rowed out just before dawn. The hole allowed a thin stream of water to enter. He watched it rise slowly between his feet, but instead of panic, he felt present. The boat didn't demand perfection, it only asked for awareness. He rowed in circles, watched the sky turn from indigo to rose, felt the ache in his arms, the salt in his lungs, the life in his body. He returned soaked but smiling. Over the next weeks, Sota and Haru repaired the boat together, not to restore it to new, but to understand it. Each plank they replaced, each rope they tightened, became a kind of conversation, without words but with meaning. Sota began to fish again, not for money, but for memory. He shared his catch with neighbors. Sometimes he'd take Haru out with him, and they'd drift in silence, two souls carried by salt and wood and sky. The hole never completely disappeared. They left it partially, visible, filled, but not hidden. A reminder. The Buddha once said, "A leaky boat will sink. Mend your mind as you would your vessel, lest sorrow drown you." But Zen adds a gentler truth. Some holes cannot be sealed with certainty. Some are meant to remind us of where the water once came in, so we sail not with fear, but with presence. Indofi. Trauma healing. We often talk of fixing ourselves, of becoming whole again. But what if healing doesn't mean sealing every crack? What if it means rowing with the awareness that water may still seep in, but trusting yourself to bail, gently, to notice, to return? Sota didn't wait until the boat was perfect. He returned to it while it still leaked. Because living, like sailing, is not about eliminating every risk. It's about showing up anyway, even with holes, even with grief, especially with grief. Tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, what part of me have I left tied to the dock, waiting to be whole again? Can I return to it, not to fix, but to sit in it, to listen, to row anyway? And as your breath slows and the tide of thought recedes, remember this: a boat with a hole can still carry you home if you're willing to sit with the water, row gently, row presently, you'll float. Story 23. The spider's thread. It was early autumn when the rains fell for 7 days straight. The temple roofs wept gently into stone gutters. The pathways turned slick with moss, and the mountains disappeared behind sheets of pale mist. In the stillness, time stretched thin. Monks moved slower, words grew fewer, and even the birds sang only when necessary. It was on the 7th day that the boy arrived, thin, soaked, silent. No one knew his name. He stood at the monastery gate without shoes, his eyes dark and wide, holding nothing but a satchel and the weight of something heavier than years. When the gatekeeper asked what he wanted, he only said, "To stay dry." They let him in. The boy did not chant. He did not bow. He ate in silence and slept on the floor near the outer corridor. At first, the monks assumed he would leave when the weather cleared, but he stayed. Days passed, then weeks. No one questioned it. Zen asks for no declaration, only presence. One morning, Master Senzu found him sitting in the garden, watching a spider. The boy didn't notice the old monk approach. His gaze was fixed on the web stretched delicately between 2 bamboo stalks. Dew clung to each thread like a string of pearls. A single spider moved slowly along the strands, pausing at the center, still as breath. Senzu knelt beside him. "Why do you watch it?" he asked. The boy blinked. "It reminds me of something I can't name." Senzu nodded. "Perhaps it's not meant to be named." The boy hesitated, then said, "It's fragile, but strong. It breaks, but it doesn't stop building." Senzu smiled. "Just like you." The boy looked away. "I've done bad things," he whispered. Senzu waited. "I stole," the boy continued. "I lied. I took food from people who were kind to me. I ran. I hid. I hurt someone once, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how not to." He clenched his fists. "I think I'm too far gone." The old monk didn't respond. Immediately, he picked up a fallen twig and held it out to the web. Carefully, he touched one of the outer strands. The spider paused. The web trembled. And then, nothing broke. "The spider does not abandon the web because it shakes," he said. "It waits. It feels. It begins again." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "But it's just a spider," he said. "So are we," Senzu answered. "Threading life from our own breath, building shelter from struggle, returning to what we feared was gone." That evening, Senzu told the story of a man once swallowed by his own cruelty. A man who, in his final moments, reached for a single thread of kindness, a memory of feeding a starving dog many years earlier. And in that small act, the thread appeared before him, lowered from the sky like a path. He grasped it. But as he climbed, he looked down and saw others reaching too. And in panic, fearing it would break, he kicked at them, shouting, "This is mine!" And at that moment, the thread snapped. Not because it was weak, but because selfishness frays even the strongest mercy. The boy asked, "Was that a true story?" Senzu replied, "It is always true, even when it isn't." From that day on, the boy began to help. Quietly, without announcement. He swept the gardens, shared his food, repaired a monk's torn robe without being asked. When visitors came, he brought tea. Sometimes he still cried at night. Sometimes he didn't sleep. But he stayed. He threaded his days with care. He became the thread. The Buddha once said, "However tangled the net of karma, the heart, if turned toward compassion, can untie it strand by strand." Modern life teaches us that redemption must be earned in grand gestures, public confessions, transformations documented and proven. But Zen knows that the path back is subtle, quiet, sometimes invisible to others. One thread, one act, one breath at a time. In trauma recovery, there is a term, repair. Not to undo, not to erase, but to meet the wound with presence. To sit with the brokenness without tightening the knot. You are not your worst moment. You are what you do after. Tonight before sleep, ask yourself, what thread of kindness have I forgotten? Can I reach for it? Not to be rescued, but to remember who I still are beneath the damage. And as your breath slows and the soft night cradles your edges, remember this. The thread does not break from weight. It breaks from fear. Hold it with grace, and it will carry you. Climb gently. You are not too far. You are only one breath away from beginning again. Story 24. The Bell of Compassion. Every evening at the hour of the ox, when the sky turned to ink and the last rays of sun kissed the temple roofs, the monks at the mountain monastery gathered in the central hall for the striking of the Jihi no cane, the bell of compassion. It was not a grand bell, not like the great bronze drums housed in imperial temples. This one was modest, shoulder height, dark with age, its surface worn smooth by the hands of generations. But when it rang, its voice carried down the valley, across the rice fields, and into the hearts of those who had long forgotten they had hearts. The bell was only struck once a day, and never without intention. The monks called it sounding for mercy. Whoever rang the bell would first kneel before it, breathe deeply, and bring to mind someone who had caused them pain, a betrayal, a wound, a grudge held like a stone in the chest. Then, if and only if they were ready, they would let the bell speak for them. Forgiveness made audible, one long low sound, vibrating through wood, stone, and flesh. The sound was never the same twice. Sometimes it trembled, like a sigh. Sometimes it roared, like thunder wrapped in velvet. But always it echoed, always it reached. One evening, a monk named Reiji stepped forward. He was known for his discipline, his fierce eyes, and the quiet intensity of someone who had endured more than he ever admitted. He had not rung the bell in 3 years. He said nothing about why. No one asked. That night, as the others knelt behind him, he placed his hands on the striker. He closed his eyes, and he saw her, his sister. He had not spoken to her since the day she turned him away at their mother's funeral. Words had been exchanged, cold, sharp, honed over decades of misunderstandings. Reiji had left without bowing, and the silence between them had stretched, year after year, like a canyon that deepened with each season. He had told himself it no longer mattered. But he still heard her voice when he meditated. He still saw her face in dreams, and tonight he had brought her to the bell. He whispered her name. Then he struck. The sound rolled out of the metal like breath released after too long. Held, it filled the chamber, trembled the walls, passed through the monks like wind through pine. Some wept, some smiled, and Reiji knelt there, not lighter, not healed, but open. Later, a novice approached him. Did it work? He asked. Reiji didn't answer at first. Then he said, it didn't change her. He paused. But it changed me. The Buddha once taught, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal law. Zen does not demand forgiveness as a virtue. It invites it as a liberation. To forgive is not to condone. It is to cease carrying what poisons you. It is not for the offender. It is for the soul that has tired of burning. Modern psychology supports this deeply. Resentment, unprocessed anger, bitterness, They lodge in the body, become illness, tension, fatigue. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is metabolizing, alchemizing, returning to yourself. The bell did not erase Reiji's pain, but it gave it voice. And in that sound, something shifted. In the weeks that followed, more monks stepped forward, some to forgive enemies, others to forgive themselves. A few rang the bell for people they had already lost, whispering their names into the dark, sending sound across the veil. The valley listened, the wind carried, and something in the world softened. Tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, who have I not yet forgiven? Not because they deserve it, but because I do. Can I whisper their name into the silence and let something deep within begin to unclench? And as your breath grows steady and the hush of night surrounds you like the echo of a bell once struck, remember this. Compassion does not erase the wound. It sings to it. Let it sing. Let it carry, even if your hands tremble, especially if they do. Story 25. The last cup of water. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the mountain peaks, draping the world in soft amber light. Shadows stretched long across the courtyard. Lanterns flickered to life one by one. Inside the small wooden room near the edge of the temple grounds, the oldest monk lay upon a thin straw mat, his breath shallow, his body still, his time nearing its end. His name was Tenrin. He had lived in the monastery for over 60 years. He had once taught the sutras, led walking meditations, tilled the soil with his hands. His laugh had echoed through the kitchens, and his gaze, fierce but kind, had calmed even the most agitated novice. Now his skin hung loose against his bones. His voice had become a whisper, and his eyes barely opened. Yet in that fragile body, there remained something unshaken. Peace. A few monks gathered at his side, waiting quietly. Among them was Kazu, the Phi, youngest, who had never spoken to Tenrin directly, but had admired him from afar. He had watched him sweep the stone paths with reverence, sip tea as if the entire world were contained in the cup. He had wondered often, how does one grow that still? Now as Tenrin's life dwindled, Kazu sat near the door, uncertain, almost breathless with awe. Suddenly, the old monk stirred. His eyes fluttered open. His gaze landed on the cup beside the bed, a simple clay bowl filled with fresh water, left there that morning by the attendant. He lifted a frail hand, motioning toward it. Kazu rose, unsure if he should approach. Another monk nodded gently, and Kazu stepped forward, hands trembling, and lifted the cup to the elder's lips. Tenrin drank slowly, each sip deliberate. He paused, midway, and whispered, "Thank you." Then he smiled, a soft, tired smile that reached past skin and bone, and finished the last of the water. He rested the empty cup on his chest, closed his eyes, and breathed out, long and quiet, like a candle accepting the wind. That was his final breath. No drama. No final words of revelation. Just that. A last cup of water, a thank you, a breath. The room fell into silence, but it wasn't heavy. It was like stepping into a clearing after a storm. Everything still, but alive. Later, as they washed and prepared his body in accordance with tradition, Kazu sat alone on the veranda, holding the empty clay cup in his hands. He turned it slowly, feeling its warmth fading. Senzu, the abbot, approached and sat beside him. "You gave him his last drink," the master said. Kazu nodded. It didn't feel like anything special at the time. But now, Senzu placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. That cup was not just water, it was presence. It was the whole of his life, the practice of being here, one breath, one sip, one moment at a time. Kazu looked down. I always thought enlightenment would be louder, Senzu chuckled softly. It's often mistaken for lightning, but more often, it's just this, a final drink taken with full awareness. The Buddha once said, just as a candle burns and eventually goes out, so too does this body. But what remains is the warmth of the light it gave. Tenrin's light was not in his teachings, not in the words he left behind. It was in how he drank water, in how he bowed to a leaf, in how he lived so completely in each instant that his death came not as a theft, but as a final exhale of love. Modern life teaches us to chase meaning, to accumulate achievement, to fear the end. But Zen teaches us to become intimate with every sip, every sound, every silence, so that when the end comes, it is simply the closing of a book we've read fully. The last page is not a tragedy, it is a completion. Tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, if this were my last cup of water, would I drink it slowly enough to notice its warmth, its weight, the gift of its presence? And as your breath slows, and the quiet of the night returns you to the stillness that waits beneath all things, remember this. The last sip is not the end of thirst. It is the honoring of having been quenched. Drink slowly. Say thank you and rest. Thank you for walking with us through still waters and stormy skies, through loss and grace, through silence and presence. If these 25 Zen stories have spoken to something within you, if they've brought comfort, reflection, or a moment of peace, we invite you to pause with us just a little longer. Let us know in the comments which story stayed with you, which one helped you soften, breathe, or begin again. Your reflections matter. Your voice becomes part of this circle. If you found meaning here, please consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing to The Empty Boat, a quiet space for wisdom, healing, and the gentle remembering of who we are beneath the noise. More journeys await. Until then, be well, be here, and let the boat carry you home.